The alien ship came down slowly. It did not roar through the sky like the old science fiction movies had always imagined. It did not shake the ground or burn the clouds. It simply appeared above the atmosphere one morning, caught the light of the sun like a silver needle, and began its descent in a long, graceful arc. It moved the way something moves when it has nothing to prove and no one to fear. The Velhari had been watching Earth for a long time, nearly 200 years by their count. They had picked up the first radio signals back when humans were still using vacuum tubes and fighting wars with propeller-driven aircraft. They had watched the early rockets go up, small shaky things that barely made it past the upper atmosphere before falling back down. They had watched the first satellites, the first moon landing, the first clumsy probes sent toward the outer planets. They had cataloged all of it with the patience of a species that had seen this story before many times with many different civilizations. And in all that watching they had reached a very clear conclusion. Humanity was young, humanity was loud. Humanity was, by every measurable standard in the Conclave's long history of first contacts, not a threat to anyone but itself. So when the serene chorus finally broke through Earth's outer atmosphere and began broadcasting a greeting signal on every major frequency, the Velhari ambassador on board, a tall gray-skinned being named Tharksville, was fully expecting awe. He was expecting humans to flood their own communication channels with noise and excitement. He was expecting their leaders to stumble over each other, trying to respond. He had seen it happen with a dozen other species. The pattern was always the same. The young civilization looked up, saw something it could not explain, and immediately fell into either panic or worship. What he got instead was a calm, measured response on a standard radio band in clear and unbroken Velhari greeting protocol. It came from a ship. Captain Derek Cole stood on the bridge of the ECS Endurance with a cup of coffee in one hand and a data pad in the other. He was a broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s with short gray hair and the kind of face that had stopped showing surprise a long time ago. He had been in deep space for 11 years. He had seen things that would have broken a younger man. An alien ship descending through Earth's atmosphere was, by his personal scale of unusual events, somewhere in the middle range. He watched the serene chorus on the main display and took a sip of his coffee. Behind him, Lieutenant Amy Holt was already at work. She was the Endurance's chief xenolinguistics officer, a small, sharp-eyed woman who had spent 6 years building translation models for theoretical alien contact scenarios that everyone in command had privately assumed would never be used. She was running 3 analysis programs at once, cross-referencing the incoming signal against every mathematical and linguistic pattern her systems could produce. Her fingers moved fast and her face was completely still, the way it always got when she was doing something she found genuinely interesting. 43 minutes after the serene chorus began broadcasting, Amy Holt opened a 2-channel and replied in a passable approximation of the Velhari greeting structure. On board the serene chorus, this caused a great deal of quiet chaos. Tharksvald was informed immediately. He stood in the communications bay and listened to the response 3 times. Then he asked his linguistic officer how long it had taken the last civilization They had contacted to decode the greeting protocol. The answer was 4 years. He listened to the human response. 4th time. Then he went back to his chair, sat down, and spent a long moment simply thinking. The Endurance was not a large ship. It was a patrol vessel built for endurance and range rather than combat. With a crew of 60 and armament that was modest by any standard. From the outside, it looked exactly like what it was, a workhorse of the United Earth Naval Command. The kind of ship that spent most of its time doing survey runs and border checks. Tharksvald's science officer had scanned it thoroughly before the descent and found nothing remarkable. What neither the science officer nor Tharksvald had thought to do was look further out. Specifically, no one had looked at the dark side of the moon. The formal greeting was exchanged that afternoon. Tharksvald transmitted a full message of peaceful intent, carefully composed over many years by the Conclave's best diplomatic minds. It offered humanity a place in the larger galactic community. It offered protection, technology, medicine, and faster-than-light travel. It described in warm and measured language the many benefits of joining an alliance of 11 star systems that had maintained peace for over 3 centuries. It also included, buried in the middle section in very polite language, clause about limitations on military development, nothing aggressive. Tharksvald had always felt simply a standard requirement for new members, a ceiling on warship tonnage, a cap on weapons yield, the kind of reasonable boundaries that kept young civilizations from accidentally destabilizing the wider community. He had included this clause in 17 first contact packages. Not once had a new civilization objected to it. Why would they? A small restriction on weapons programs was a trivial price. Ambassador Claire Donovan received the full message in a secure facility in Geneva. She read it twice, made several notes in the margins, and then called a meeting with her senior advisors that lasted most of the night. She was a tall woman with dark hair, going gray at the temples, and she had spent 30 years in diplomatic service before being appointed Earth's first contact representative. She had a reputation for being very difficult to read, which her colleagues considered a professional strength, and her opponents considered deeply unsettling. In the morning, she recorded a response. She thanked the Velhari warmly for their message. She expressed humanity's genuine interest in building a relationship with the Conclave. She agreed to formal face-to-face negotiations at the earliest opportunity. Her tone was gracious, and her words were careful, and everything she said was completely sincere. She did not mention the armament clause. She also did not mention that the Endurance was not the only human ship in the area. She did not mention the 3 heavy cruisers sitting at a standard patrol distance on the far side of Mars. She did not mention the listening post on Titan or the long-range sensor network that had tracked the Supreme Chorus from the moment it entered the outer solar system hours before it became visible to Earth's ground-based observatories. And she absolutely did not mention the fleet. Captain Derek Cole finished his coffee, set the cup down on the console, and made a short entry in the ship's log. He noted the time of first contact, the frequency used, the duration of the exchange, and the identity of the alien. vessel, he noted that Lieutenant Holt had performed an outstanding job with the translation work under time pressure. Then he noted that the dark side of the moon remained, as far as the Velhari were concerned, completely unremarkable. He closed the log, looked out at the stars for a moment, and thought that things were about to get very interesting. The station went up in 6 weeks. That by itself was enough to give the Velhari pause. They had offered to help with the construction. They had assumed, based on everything they knew about human technology, that the offer would be accepted with gratitude. Instead, Ambassador Claire Donovan had thanked them politely, told them that Earth had the matter well in hand, and 6 weeks later a fully functional orbital station was sitting in lower Earth orbit, ready for use. Tharksville had looked at the construction timeline in the mission report and said nothing for a very long time. The station was not fancy. It was solid and practical, and built with the kind of no-nonsense efficiency that the Velhari were starting to notice was a pattern with these people. It had meeting rooms, sleeping quarters, a shared dining area, and a long observation window that looked down at the blue curve of the Earth below. The humans had put a coffee machine in the dining area. They had also, in a small gesture that Tharksville found oddly touching, placed a simple vase of flowers on the main negotiating table. He did not know what kind of flowers they were. He thought they were probably not significant. He made a note to ask and then forgot about it because the meeting started and everything else pushed the thought aside. Ambassador Claire Donovan arrived first. She came with 3 people. There was Lieutenant Amy Holt, who had done the translation work during the initial contact and who sat to the ambassador's left with a thin tablet and the quiet energy of someone who was recording absolutely everything. There was a man named Dr. Nathan Burke, who was introduced as a senior science advisor and who took a seat at the far end of the table, opened a notebook made of actual paper, and immediately began writing things down without looking up. And there was a younger man named Lieutenant Kevin Marsh, who said almost nothing but who Tharksville's security advisor quietly flagged as almost certainly military, based on the way he sat and the way his eyes moved around the room. The Velhari delegation was larger. Tharksville had brought a full diplomatic team, a pair of science officers, 2 security staff, and his chief interpreter, a patient and experienced being named Oval, who had handled first contact translations for 30 years and who had, up until this assignment, considered himself unshakable. Oval was already beginning to revise that opinion. The talks began with the standard exchange of historical and cultural information, which was normal procedure and which both sides handled gracefully. The humans were genuinely curious about Velhari history, and they asked good questions, specific, thoughtful questions that suggested they had studied the initial greeting package carefully. Tharksville found this pleasing. It was always a good sign when a new civilization took the time to actually read what you sent them. Then the formal proposal came to the table and the atmosphere shifted. Tharksville laid out the terms of conclave membership clearly and without pressure. He described the trade benefits, the medical technology exchange, the faster-than-light travel access. He described the collective security guarantee, the understanding that an attack on any member world was treated as an attack on all 11 systems. He talked about the peace the conclave had maintained for 3 centuries and the stability it had brought to a part of the galaxy that had once been extremely dangerous. And then he came to the armament clause. He explained it carefully. A ceiling on warship tonnage, a cap on weapons yield, nothing excessive, simply a standard condition of membership, applied equally to every civilization that joined the conclave. It was about balance, he said, about making sure that no single member became so powerful that the alliance lost its cooperative nature. It was a rule that had served the conclave well for a very long time. He watched Ambassador Donovan's face. While he spoke, she was listening. Her expression was attentive and respectful and gave away absolutely nothing. When he finished, she thanked him for the thorough explanation and said she would need time to consult with her government. She was back the next morning. She thanked him again for the conclave's generous offer. She said that Earth was genuinely interested in a long and productive relationship with the Velhari. She said that the trade terms were interesting and that the scientific exchange proposal had been received with great enthusiasm back home. Then she said very calmly that Earth could not accept the armament clause. Tharksville had not expected that. In 17 first contacts across a career spanning 4 decades of diplomatic work, no one had ever turned down the armament clause. 2 civilizations had asked for modifications. 3 had asked for a grace period before compliance, but none had simply said no. He asked why. She said it was a matter of principle. Earth did not accept limits placed on its defense capacity by any external body. She said it with no heat in her voice and no apology in her expression. It was simply a fact she was stating, the way you might state that the sun rises in the east. Open trade, free scientific exchange, a mutual non-aggression pact, shared intelligence on threats from hostile civilizations, and a framework for future cooperation on exploration and research. Everything the conclave had offered, except the part where Earth agreed to limit its military. Tharksville asked for a recess. In the corridor, his team spoke quickly and quietly. His military advisor pointed out what everyone already knew, that based on the conclave scans, Earth had a modest collection of patrol vessels and 2 aging space stations. It had no warships of significant size. The armament clause would barely affect them at all. So why refuse it? No one had a good answer. When they returned to the table, Tharksville tried a different approach. He leaned forward and spoke with genuine care in his voice. He told Ambassador Donovan about the wider galaxy. He described the Kreth All Dominion, a militaristic empire on the far edge of conclave space that had absorbed 6 civilizations in 2 centuries by finding them alone and unprepared. He described the Solhari raiders who preyed on unaffiliated trade routes. He told her as gently as he could that humanity did not yet understand how dangerous the universe was, and that the conclave's protection was not a small thing. It was during this speech that Dr. Nathan Burke looked up from his notebook. For the first time, he looked up and he looked at Tharksville, and he asked in a quiet and completely even voice what the largest warship in the conclave's history had been. He wanted specifics: tonnage, weapons, yield, shielding class, drive type, crew capacity. Tharksville answered, a little confused by the sudden question. Burke wrote the numbers down in his paper notebook. He looked at what he had written for a moment. Then he nodded once slowly, the way a person nods when something they already suspected turns out to be confirmed. He said nothing else. He went back to his notebook. Oval, the interpreter, later told Tharksville that he had felt in that moment the way he had once felt standing at the edge of a very deep lake and suddenly realizing the water was not still. It was moving slowly, almost invisibly, but moving. Tharksville had laughed at the time. It was the science officer who found it first. Her name was Vexa, and she was one of the best deep scan analysts in the Velhari fleet. She had spent 20 years reading gravitational data the way some people read books, quickly, easily finding meaning and patterns that most others simply could not see. She had mapped star systems, located hidden asteroid fields, and once identified an undeclared weapons depot on a rogue moon just by the way it bent the gravity around it. She was doing a routine scan of the lunar body, Earth's single natural satellite, on the morning of the third day of talks, mostly out of habit. When she found the shadow, it was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It was simply a small wrongness in the gravitational data, a place where the numbers did not quite match the expected readings for an unremarkable moon with no significant structures on its surface. She almost moved past it. She had been running scans for weeks, and the moon had always come back clean. But Vexa did not move past things that did not add up. She ran the scan again, same result. She adjusted the sensor array and ran it a third time from a different angle. The shadow was still there, sitting on the far side of the moon, like something very large and very heavy was resting on the surface or just above it. She stared at her screen for a long moment. Then she quietly flagged the data, marked it as high priority, and sent it directly to Tharksville without putting it through the standard reporting chain. Some instinct, built over 20 years of reading things that did not belong, told her that this was not something to leave sitting in a queue. Tharksville received the report during the midday recess while he was eating a small meal in his private cabin. He read it once, set down his food, and read it again. Then he called Vexa directly and asked her to walk him through the numbers. She did. She was calm about it, the way she was always calm about everything. But even through her professional composure, he could hear something careful in her voice. The shadow's mass estimate, based on the gravitational distortion alone, came out at somewhere between 4 and 6 million metric tons. She had run the calculation 4 times to make sure. The result did not change. Tharksville knew ships. He had served in the Velhari fleet for 12 years before moving into diplomatic work. He knew every major class of vessel in the conclave inventory by weight and profile. He knew the numbers for every significant warship in the databases of every civilization they had formal contact with. 4 to 6 million metric tons was not a number that belonged to anything he had ever heard of. The largest warship the conclave had ever built, the legendary Veth class dreadnought, of which only 3 had ever been constructed, weighed 800,000 metric tons at full load. It was considered by most military analysts in the known galaxy to be a civilization-ending weapon. Governments that knew the Veth class existed spoke about it carefully in low voices. The way you speak about something you hope never has a reason to move. Whatever was sitting on the dark side of Earth's moon was 5 times heavier. He asked Vexu if there was any chance. The readings were wrong, a sensor error, a geological anomaly, some kind of interference from the planet below. She said she had already checked all of those possibilities. She had also checked whether the shadow could be explained by natural lunar density variations. It could not. The shape of the gravitational distortion was too regular, too deliberate, too clearly the outline of something constructed rather than something grown. She also said very quietly that she was not sure the object had been there 6 weeks ago. When she went back through the archived, scanned data from their initial orbital approach, the shadow was either absent or masked so completely by some kind of dampening system that their instruments had simply not registered it. She could not say which, she was not sure which answer was more unsettling. Tharksville sat with that information for a few minutes. Then he straightened up, finished his meal without tasting it, and went back to the negotiating table. He waited until there was a natural pause in the discussion. Then he asked Ambassador Donovan in the most diplomatic language he could find if she could explain the gravitational anomaly on the far side of the moon. He watched her face. There was no surprise, there was no flicker of discomfort. Her expression did not change in any way. That suggested she was caught off guard. She simply looked at him for a moment, the way a person looks when they are deciding how much of a straightforward answer to give, and then she said it was a routine military asset. He asked her to explain the word routine. She said it was one of several. The Velhari delegation asked for a recess in the corridor outside the meeting room. The conversation was fast and tense. Vexa had been brought in remotely, and her numbers were put up on a shared display. Tharksville's military advisor, a stocky and experienced officer named Breath, who had served in 4 border conflicts and who was not easily shaken by anything, looked at the mass estimate for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at the profile data Vexer had been able to pull from the partial deep scan. Incomplete, frustratingly incomplete, absorbed in large sections by a material that their database had no record of. And he said in a flat voice that he did not recognize the whole composition. He said that was not something that happened to him. Someone asked how old they thought the ship was, how long it might have been sitting there. Vexer said she could not give a confident answer. The masking technology, whatever it was, had been extremely effective. She could say that based on the construction quality visible in the partial scan. This was not a new or experimental vessel. It had the look of something that had been built, tested, proven, and put into service. It had the look of something that was not the first of its kind. That last part sat in the corridor like a stone dropped into still water. They went back to the table. Tharksfell folded his hands and asked carefully when that ship had been built. Ambassador Donovan spoke briefly with Dr. Burke in a low voice. Burke did not look up from his notebook. He said something short and she nodded. And then she looked back at Tharksfell and said that she was not able to discuss specific construction timelines. But she could confirm, she said, that it was not the only one. The interpreter Oval translated this Sentence accurately and without editorializing. Later in his private log, he noted that it was the most frightening sentence he ever been asked to translate in 30 years of first contact work. The words were simple and calm and delivered with a pleasant expression. It was the part about not being the only one. That was the part that stayed with him. The message came in on the 9th morning. Tharksfell was drinking a warm cup of the herbal drink his people used to start their days when the alert came through on his personal communicator. He set the cup down and read the message once. Then he stood up slowly, walked to the window of his cabin and looked down at the blue and white curve of the earth below for a long moment. The message was from one of the Velhari long-range patrol craft stationed at the edge of the solar system. It had picked up a drive signature. Not one signature, 14. The Kreth All Dominion had come to have a look. This was not entirely unexpected. Kreth All had a long and well-documented habit of showing up whenever a new civilization made first contact with the wider galactic community. They were not subtle about what they were doing. They sent warships to the edges of new systems, ran their sensors hard, tested communication responses, and watched. What they were looking for was weakness, a hesitation, a sign that the new species was alone and unsure and could be frightened into submission before it had a chance to build real alliances. They had done this successfully 6 times in the last 2 centuries. The 14 ships were running quiet, no active weapons locks, no direct communication, no obvious aggressive maneuver. But they were there, and they were Kreth. All and everyone who knew anything about them understood that their presence was the message. They were saying, "We see you, we are deciding what to do about you. Show us what you have." Tharksville went to the negotiating room early and waited for the human delegation to arrive. When Ambassador Claire Donovan walked in, he did not wait for the formal opening of the session. He told her immediately. He laid it all out. Who the Krethal were, what their history looked like, what 14 warships sitting at the edge of the solar system meant when they belonged to the Kreth All Dominion. He told her about the 6 civilizations. He told her what had happened to them. 2 had been absorbed entirely, their populations reduced to a labor class. Under Kreth All administration, 2 had fought and lost and spent a generation rebuilding. 2 had simply ceased to exist as independent cultures within 50 years of first contact with the Dominion. He told her that the Conclave's nearest warship was 6 days away at best speed. He said this last part with genuine regret in his voice. He had not wanted this to happen. He had hoped that the talks would be finished and Earth would be under the Conclave's protection umbrella before the Kreth All took any interest. He was sorry. He said it plainly, and he meant it. Ambassador Donovan listened to all of it. Without interrupting, she sat with her hands folded on the table and her eyes on Tharksville's face, and she let him say everything he needed to say. When he finished, the room was quiet for a few seconds. Then she said she appreciated him telling her. She said she would need a few minutes. She stood, excused herself, and walked out of the room. Lieutenant Kevin Marsh followed her into the corridor. Through the thin wall, Tharksville could hear nothing, no raised voices, no urgency, just the low murmur of a short conversation. It lasted less than 4 Minutes. When she came back, she looked exactly the same as she always did. She sat down, smoothed the front of her jacket, and told Tharksval that the matter had been handled. He did not understand what that meant. He started to ask, but something in her expression, something in the absolute stillness of it, made him stop. He turned instead to the small sensor display that Vexa had patched into the meeting room at his request 3 days ago, after the gravitational shadow had been found. It was a simple real-time feed from the serene chorus overhead. The dark side of the moon was empty. The gravitational shadow was gone. Tharksval stared at the display. He pulled up the timestamp. The shadow had disappeared in the last 4 minutes, while the ambassador was in the corridor. He looked at the drive emission data. There was nothing, no engine flare, no radiation burst, no sign of a vessel of any size moving away from the lunar surface. Something that weighed between 4 and 6 million metric tons had simply ceased to be where it was. He switched the display to the outer solar system feed. 11 minutes later, it appeared. The long-range sensors of the patrol craft at the system's edge registered the arrival before the visual feed caught up. The mass reading came through first. That same enormous number, unmistakable now to every science officer in the Velhari fleet who had seen Vexa's report. Then the drive signature resolved, and it was unlike anything in the Velhari database. Not because it was primitive, because it was something else entirely. A drive type that their analysts would spend the next 2 years trying to understand and never fully explain. Then the visual feed sharpened and they saw it. The ECS Avalon was not a beautiful ship. It was not designed to be. It was long and dense and angular, built in heavy layered sections like a mountain that had been turned on its side and fitted with engines. Its hull was a dark, non-reflective material that seemed to pull light in rather than bounce it back. Along its full length, weapon platforms sat in rows, not the sleek tapered designs that the Velhari favored, but thick and squared off and very clearly built for one purpose. At its prow, a sensor array the size of a small space station rotated in a slow, steady arc, sweeping the area with the calm patience of something that had all the time in the world. It had placed itself between the inner solar system and the Kreth all formation. It did not fire, it did not power up its weapons to an active state. It simply sat there in the dark between the sun and the 14 Kreth all warships, and existed. Then Commander Marcus Webb opened a channel. He identified himself in clean and correct Kreth all language, language that no human was supposed to know as far as any record in the Conclave's database was concerned. He stated his name, his rank, his vessel's designation. His voice was level and unhurried. He said that he was the commanding officer of the ECS Avalon, representing the United Earth Naval Command, and he wanted to know if there was something the Kreth all needed in this solar system. There was a long silence from the Kreth all side. Tharksval had dealt with the Kreth all before. He knew their communication patterns. A long silence from them was not confusion, it was calculation. They were looking at the Avalon on their own sensors. They were running the numbers. They were doing the same thing that Vexar had done, staring at a mass reading and a whole profile in a drive signature and trying to find a category in their database that fit what they were seeing. They were not finding one. The silence stretched, 30 seconds, a minute, 90 seconds. Without a word, the Krethal formation began to move. All 14 ships turned at roughly the same time. They did not turn slowly or with any suggestion of dignity. They accelerated back the way they had come. And the sensor data from the patrol craft showed that 2 of them had jettisoned their external weapon pods. Heavy, expensive, not easy to replace weapon pods in order to move faster. They did not send a response to Commander Webb's message. Not a single word. Back in the meeting room on the orbital station, the silence lasted a little longer. Tharksville sat looking at his sensor display. Nathan Burke had put down his paper notebook and was also looking at the display with the expression of a man watching something he had expected to happen, but still found satisfying to see. Confirmed. Ambassador Donovan poured herself glass of water from the jug on the table. She asked Tharksville in a kind and genuine voice if he would like a short break before they continued with the talks. He said yes. He needed a moment to sit quietly and completely revise everything he had believed about this species for the last 9 days. Tharksville did not sleep well that night. He lay in his cabin on the Supreme Chorus and stared at the ceiling and thought about numbers. He thought about the mass reading Vexa had pulled from the gravitational shadow. He thought about the drive signature that his analysts still could not classify. He thought about the 14 Kreth warships that had turned and run without saying a single word, and about the 2 weapon pods they had jettisoned just to get away faster. Those pods were not cheap. The Krethal did not throw away expensive equipment easily. They had looked at the ECS Avalon on their sensors, done their calculations, and decided that the fastest possible exit was worth any price. He thought about what that meant. Something that had been sitting at the back of his mind since the very first day of talks, and that he had not let himself look at directly until now. The Conclave had been watching Earth for 200 years. 200 years of careful, thorough observation. They had cataloged every rocket launch, every satellite deployment, every communication signal that left the planet. They had built a detailed picture of human technological development, and they had been confident in that picture, confident enough to send a diplomatic vessel, confident enough to assume that the armament clause would be accepted without argument, confident enough to believe that humanity was exactly what it looked like from the outside, a young, loud, still developing civilization that would be grateful for the protection of a larger alliance. And all of that confidence had been based on what humanity had chosen to show. He sat up in bed and pulled up his data pad. He opened the intelligence file that the Conclave had compiled on the Sol system over 2 centuries of observation, and he read through it slowly, this time looking not at what was there, but at what was missing, what had never been scanned, what had never been fully resolved. The dark side of the moon, the outer system, beyond the standard patrol range, the deep shadow zones behind the gas giants where sensors did not reach clearly, the areas that had always come back clean, not because they were empty, but because something in them had made sure they came back clean. He closed the file and sat in the dark. For a while. In the morning, he went back to the negotiating table, looking like a man who had made peace with something difficult. Overnight, the human delegation arrived as they always did, on time, composed, carrying their coffee and their notebooks. Ambassador Claire Donovan took her seat and asked how he was, and he told her honestly that he had not slept much. She nodded and said she understood. She did not say anything else about it. She did not push. She simply waited with the same unhurried patience she had shown every single day of the talks and let him set the pace. He told her that he wanted to speak plainly. He said that the conclave had made a number of assumptions about Earth that had turned out to be wrong, and that he thought both sides would benefit from starting the next phase of talks from a more honest position. She said she agreed completely. He asked her, not as an official question, not for the record, just one person asking another, how long the Avalon had been in service. She looked at him for a moment, then she looked at Dr. Nathan Burke, who was already at the table with his paper notebook open. Burke glanced up briefly and gave a small shrug that seemed to mean it was her call. She told him, not everything, but enough. The Avalon had been commissioned over 20 years ago. It was not the newest ship in the United Earth Naval Command's deep fleet. It was not the largest. It was the one that had been assigned to Home System Patrol, because its crew had the most first contact protocol training. Tharksville absorbed this information carefully. He asked what the newest one was like. Burke looked up again. This time he almost smiled. He said that was not something they were going to discuss today. Tharksville decided not to push that particular door. The talks that followed were different from the ones that had come before. The air in the room had changed. There was no performance now on either side, no careful positioning, no diplomatic softening of things that needed to be said plainly. Tharksville put the original conclave membership proposal to one side and started fresh. He asked Ambassador Donovan what kind of relationship Earth actually wanted with the wider galactic community. She said she wanted what she had always said she wanted: honest trade, free scientific exchange, a genuine non-aggression agreement, shared information about threats like the Kreth, also that no one got caught by surprise, a framework that treated both sides as equals because she said simply they were. The last part landed quietly but clearly. Tharksville thought about the 800,000-ton Veth-class dreadnought that the Conclave had always considered its ultimate deterrent. He thought about the thing sitting at the end of the Sol system right now, which was 5 times heavier and moved in ways his engineers could not explain. He thought about the fact that the Avalon was apparently not the newest or the largest. He agreed that they were equals. He said it without hesitation because it was true and because pretending otherwise would have been embarrassing for everyone. The new draft treaty took 3 more days to write. It had none of the original membership clauses. There was no armament ceiling, no tribute arrangement, no tiered membership structure. What it had was a trade agreement that was genuinely balanced, a scientific exchange program that both sides were visibly excited about, a mutual defense clause that used careful language but that everyone in the room understood meant something real. and a joint intelligence sharing protocol specifically designed to early warning about Kreth all movements in the region. Several of Thark's Val's superiors back home when they reviewed the final document found the mutual defense clause quietly embarrassing. It was written as though both parties were protecting each other equally. Everyone knew which party was doing most of the protecting. The Velhari side had asked to remove the clause entirely rather than sign something that felt like it needed to be read between the lines. Thark's Val had told them to sign it anyway. He said that the humans had written it that way on purpose and that it was a kindness worth accepting. On the final day, the treaty was printed on physical paper. A human tradition, Ambassador Donovan had explained, for documents that were meant to last. She signed it with a simple black pen, the same one she had used to make notes in the margins of documents all through the talks. Thark's Val signed it with a Velhari stylus and noted privately that the whole ceremony was shorter and less formal than any other treaty signing he had attended. There was coffee and a plate of small sweet things that the humans called cookies, and Lieutenant Amy Holt shook hands with Yuval the interpreter, and they spent 20 minutes excitedly comparing notes on each other's languages. When it was done, Thark's Vel found himself standing at the long observation window with Ambassador Donovan, looking down at the Earth below. The planet turned slowly in the light of its sun. From up here it looked quiet and simple. Blue water, white cloud, green and brown land. He had looked at that planet from orbit for weeks and thought he understood it. He said this to her. He said that he had watched Earth for a long time and then very certain he knew what it was, and that he had been wrong in almost every way that mattered. She looked at the planet below them for a moment before she answered. She said that humanity had spent a very long time looking out at the stars and wondering what was out there, wondering if it was friendly or dangerous, wondering whether to call out or stay quiet. She said that they had decided a long time ago to be ready for either, to hope for the best and prepare for the worst and not advertise which preparation they had made. She said they had always hoped the first voice they heard back would be a friendly one. She looked at him when she said that last part. Thark's Vel thought about the Kreth all, who had come in 14 warships and left in silence with empty weapon racks. He thought about what would have happened to this small blue planet if the Serene Chorus had never come, and the Krethtal had arrived instead, and found humanity alone. He thought about what would have happened to the Krethtal if they had decided to stay. He told her that he was very glad to have been the friendly voice. She smiled. It was the first fully unguarded expression he had seen from her in the entire length of the talks. It lasted only a moment, and then she was composed again and offering him another cookie and asking if he had tried the ones with chocolate yet. He had not. He tried one. It was, he decided, very good. Some things, it turned out, did not need to be complicated.